Now that we've created our Firebase project, let's connect it with our React app. And to do that, we just need to click the code button here. If we click on Project Overview, we can hit the code button, and we need to register our app. So we can give our app a nickname. We can just give it the nickname TikTok clone, register it, and then we're going to be given instructions to add the Firebase SDK. So it tells us to install Firebase. We already have that dependency installed. All we're going to need is this Firebase config object. So we're going to copy this object, and then we're going to head to VSCode, and specifically within source, we're going to look for lib and then Firebase config.js and just paste that in right here. We're going to need to export it with export default Firebase config. We want to import this config and set up Firebase using the Firebase dependency here within Firebase.js. So it's within still the lib folder here. Note before we move on that since this is sensitive information about our application, we don't want to expose this to the world. So if you're using GitHub for version control, I've already included within our git ignore file this specific Firebase config.js file to make sure it's not included in the repository that you push to GitHub. We're going to begin by importing Firebase, and we're not going to import Firebase entirely, the complete dependency. We're just going to import the individual modules that we need. So we're going to import Firebase from Firebase/app, and we're going to need to import individually all of the different tools that we set up. So there's specific code for Firebase/Firestore for the Firestore database. We're also going to need to import Firebase/auth for authentication, Firebase/storage, and finally we're going to import the Firebase config object from lib/Firebase config. Now we need to use Firebase to initialize our app, but we want to make sure that we only initialize it once. So we can check to make sure that we only have initialized it once by saying not firebase.apps.length. If that value is 0, we can use a ternary to say we want to initialize the app by saying firebase.initializeApp, and we want to pass to that method our Firebase config object. Otherwise, if it already is initialized, we just want to call firebase.app. And since our ternary returns a value, we can just put our initialized app within this app variable. So what can we do using our initialized app? Well, we can set up all of the tools, all of the modules that we imported using our initialized app. This will give us a reference to very easily interact with the Firestore database, with the auth module, with storage, etc. So we're going to create dedicated variables that we're going to export and pass around our app to be able to interact with our database, with authentication, with our storage, etc. So first of all, we'll set up our Firestore database using the Firestore method, and we'll put it in a variable called db. Next, we'll have a variable auth, which we'll set up with app.auth. Then our storage with app.storage, and a variable called storage. We're going to need a provider variable, and this is specifically for any provider that we set up. Since we're just, or at least I am just setting up the Google Auth provider, we can say new firebase.auth.google auth provider, and you would need to create multiple providers if, say, you were setting up authentication with Twitter and Facebook, etc. So this might be Google provider. If that was the case, I'm just going to leave this as provider since we only have one. We're going to have a server timestamp variable to be able to determine what time it is on the server whenever we say upload a file or we add an item to a database. This is going to allow us to get an accurate time when, say, something was created or updated. And we can get that server timestamp by saying firebase.firestore.fieldValue, capitalize the F in field.server timestamp. And then finally, we're going to have a helpful reference called increment. This is when we want to increment a value in our database, such as when we want to increment a like count. So if somebody likes one of our posts or a user's post, we can use increment in order to just increase the value in the database by 1 for that particular field. So we can say firebase.firestore.fieldValue dot increment. And we will not call this as a method, unlike all the other variables that we created. So finally, we want to export everything within an object. We can export auth, provider, storage, server timestamp, increment, and then since we're going to be using the database a lot, we can use export default DB. So at this point, we have Firebase set up and we're ready to start using it within our app.